Well, good afternoon again, folks. Great to be with you. And I'm going to be talking about something that was, in fact, quite close to Bob's own heart. He was very interested in the study of material culture, and he was particularly interested in gravestones and funeral monuments as a way of understanding changes that were occurring as a result of the processes associated with the plantation. He was well known as someone who could be found in many graveyards across the north of Ireland. There's a story told by John Morrill in his introduction to Bob's collected essays that one day Bob and one of his collaborators planned to go out to an old graveyard in Donegal to look for a particular headstone or ledger stone. And unfortunately, they sat in Bob's house drinking tea for quite a long time. So by the time they set off for Donegal, it was getting dark, and by the time they reached the graveyard, it was even darker. Now, the sight of a couple of men going into an old graveyard in the dusk with spades and shovels did excite some local interest. Morrill relates how a crowd gathered that was suspicious, maybe even a little hostile. But the tension was broken when somebody in the crowd shouted out, "Hey, that's Bob Hunter, he taught me!" And the suspicion evaporated, and then it was one of friendly cooperation. Now, what we find in the plantation period, it's not the beginning of stone monuments with inscriptions. There were certainly in the northwest, and my talk is particularly focused on the northwest, there were certainly medieval grave slabs. You can find them in a number of places in graveyards around Donegal. There's a famous one at Clonca graveyard in Inishowen, to a Magnus McCorriston that shows a sword and a cross and a stick with a little ball, a hurling stick, probably a shinty stick, with a ball. So there were certainly inscribed stones from the medieval period, but it is with the plantation that we begin to see many more of these memorials, tombstones with inscriptions, and inscriptions in English and displaying various forms of symbolism. So let me take an example. This is one of the earliest. It's in a location that it's almost impossible to get a good photograph of it, so a friend of mine sketched it out. But you can see, first of all, the inscription runs around the edge of the stone. So the inscription is marginal to the stone. Here is the burial place of John McGee, who deceased the 26th of February 1617, and his family. So marking out the burial place of John McGee and his family. And this was a way in which the incoming settler community were able to put down roots, not simply in establishing their farms and homesteads, but in establishing places of burial that were marked out as being their own. You'll notice as well the coat of arms. Those are, well, I now know those are actually supposed to be leopards' heads. That's the McGee coat of arms. You see the hand clasping a sword, and above that, a Celtic cross. Now, these McGees are very interesting. They came across from Dumfries in the south of Scotland. They were a Catholic family who established a base and were actually very much involved with the Hamiltons. The Hamilton landlords in Strabane Barney included quite a few Catholics among their number. I will come back to that at the end of this presentation. Again, another example of a very early stone. Now, in this case, unfortunately, the surname is illegible. It's just gone. But you can see it's built. It's now on its side. It's built into a low retaining wall at Taboyne Churchyard near St Johnston in Donegal. Again, the inscription runs along here. We've got John, but surname gone. It's from 1626. But it does tell us that John, whoever he was a cloth worker. So his occupation is recorded on the stone. And we do know from plantation records that in this area there were tuck mills, woolen mills. So part of the plantation economy, woolen mills were in operation in this area. And maybe this John, whoever he was employed or worked or ran or managed one of these tuck mills. So it's interesting again that we're not dealing with monuments to the elites in society, the landowning classes. I mean, a cloth worker. We have a tombstone to a cloth worker who died in 1626 in this graveyard in Donegal. A Grange graveyard. We have headstone or a tombstone to a Robert Granger. It's just coincidence that Granger should be buried in Grange graveyard, of all places. And this is one of the stones. Bob, in his essay in Tyrone History and Society, explored some of the very earliest tombstones in County Tyrone. And he pays attention to this one, and even in the slightest details, Bob could bring out so much. So again, we know that Robert Granger was one of the early Scots to settle in this area. He's recorded in the 1622 certificate as part of the plantation survey. We even know the townland he lived in because of the Suminister rolls that have survived and which are part of the database. Again, the coat of arms. So again, signifying a certain status. 3 stags' heads. Again, note inscription around the edge of the stone. 1630. Okay, Robert Granger died in 1630. It begins "here lieth," and even the spelling of "here," it's H-E-I-R. And Bob notes, well, that's hints of the Lowland Scots. Of course, they were coming in from Lowland Scotland predominantly to this area, predominantly from Renfrewshire and Lanarkshire, to this part of County Tyrone. So memorials like this, again, they can help us to connect with the period, but they also reveal something of the character, the outlook, the priorities, you could say, of the families coming in and their importance the importance they attached to places of burial. Now, we also find memorials in churches of varying sophistication. So this is one in Raphoe Cathedral. It's really a large, rough slab on which there is an inscription. You know, it's in uppercase, Roman capitals. It's in Latin. The other ones I showed you were in English, but this is in Latin. Maybe not surprisingly, this is to the wife of a clergyman, Archibald Adair, Dean of Raphoe. And it's to his wife, Ginetta. He gives her maiden name, Houston, and records that although she died at the age of only 20, she had already given birth to twins twice. Only one of each pairing of twins had actually survived. But it says a curious stone. There's nothing particularly sophisticated about it. It's quite crude in a way in terms of its execution. But nonetheless, packed into the inscription, there's so much information about this particular family. And it extols the virtues of Ginetta, the wife of Archibald Adair. Much more sophisticated is the Hansard Monument in Clonlee Parish Church in Lifford, not very far away from Raphoe, in County Donegal. This is a monument to Sir Richard Hansard and his wife, Diamand. Now, you can see 2 figures kneeling, dressed in contemporary costume, kneeling over against the prayer stool, and the inscription behind it. And again, the inscription goes into such detail about Sir Richard Hansard. He died in 1619, October 1619. His wife died just a couple of days later, in 1619. The inscription tells us quite a bit about Hansard. It records how he was born in Lincolnshire. He was a Master of Arts at Cambridge. He was in the Elizabethan army in Ireland. He was granted the fort of Lifford after the 9 Years' War, which ended in 1603. How he was given a patent to develop Lifford as a town in the plantation. How in his will he left money to found a church and a school and to employ a schoolmaster. And it names the executors to his will and how they had fulfilled the conditions in that will. Although it's a monument to Sir Richard very obviously, it's also a monument to the executors and the exactness with which they had carried out the instructions in his will. If you look very closely at it, you'll see where the noses have been sliced off. There's a story that during the Williamite War, Jacobite soldiers came into the church and sliced off the noses of the figures, which were then subsequently replaced. In the mid-19th century, it was actually painted completely black but whenever they began to take the paint off, they discovered that the original colours were preserved underneath. Now, in this case, we don't quite know who was responsible for the monument. Amy Harris, who's here today, Dr. Amy Harris has completed a thesis on monuments, church monuments in Ireland, 1560 to 1660. So we can have a word of her about that. But it's likely that it was imported rather than being executed by a local craftsman. I think, don't really know for sure. It's not quite as grand as the Chichester Monument in Carrickfergus. It's not really grand at all compared to that. But it is, as one historian described, a more homely affair in terms of funeral sculpture. Now you can find other monuments. I'm stepping outside Ulster here, but I show this because this is the freestanding monument at Ardbracken to George Montgomery, who in 1605 was appointed Bishop of Derry, Raphoe and Clogher, and who played such a formative role in ensuring that the new church, the new Reformed church, was in such a sound landed base. That was really his main aim, to secure a significant landed endowment for the church. He, after he gave up Derry and Raphoe, he kept Clogher for a while, but he was appointed Bishop of Meath, and his monument is here at Ardbracken in Meath. And it is a remarkable structure for its time. You can see again the effigial figures carved into it. You also find examples of that, again, not very far from here at Bangor, the Bradshaw stone in Bangor Abbey in County Down. And you can see the way the inscription in false relief, again, some of it runs around the edge of the stone. Notice the memento mori, remember you must die, the skull, the crossed bones. And then these three figures. Again, look at the detail there. TB, Thomas Bradshaw, and we think his wife and daughter. So you notice the detail, the ruff around the neck and so on. It's really quite an amazing memorial. It's inside the church now. And then one wonders, was it always inside the church, or had it been brought in from the churchyard at some point? Now, not all monuments survive. Many were destroyed. Many we know were lost in the 1641 uprising. This is all that remains of a memorial to the wife of Sir James Montgomery. She was a Stuart, Catherine Stuart, the daughter of Sir William Stuart, who gave his name to Newton Stuart, and it's in the church in Newton Stuart. But it's all that's left of a much larger and grander monument that was destroyed in 1641. Towards the end of the 17th century, he was William Montgomery of Rosemount, the famous author of the Montgomery manuscripts, wrote that it was curious and sumptuous, of divers colours, all polished marble, inscribed with mottos and verses of his, that is her husband's, own composure, and gilded in every fit place. So William had a memory of his mother's monument here at Newton Stuart. Sadly, that's all that remains of it today. Now, you can find in some cases tools associated with the deceased represented on the tombstones. I've mentioned the clothwork. I'll name some of the clothworker. Well, here we have William Stenners. This again is in Bangor Abbey. William Stenners, here line of body William Stenners, Master Mason. Okay, M.R. Mason, Master Mason. And you can see on it shield, and then the tools of the grave, or not the grave, the mason carved on it. So linking his occupation with representations of the tools he used in the course of his work. And one wonders, for example, was William Stenners the man responsible for restoring Bangor Abbey Church in the early 17th century, or even building the new manor house for Sir James Hamilton at Bangor, which is shown on the Raven maps of 1625-26 that Annalee has referred to already. Let's move back. Now, I've shown skulls and crossbones and so on already. This is a period in which mortality symbols are appearing on many of the headstones. Symbols associated with death. I mean, there was a preoccupation with death. Not surprising in an era where so many people died young, where there's so much infant mortality, that this should be a central preoccupation. Memento mori, remember you must die. And we see different representations of mortality symbols and stones. So this is the Pockridge stone. This is in Enniskillen, inside St McCartan's Cathedral. Again, the inscription runs like this, and then it goes around the stone. The verse on this is actually taken from the statement made by Thomas Cromwell just before his execution in 1540. But we have a representation of the skull. Now, we do see varying depictions of skulls or death's head. You can sort of make an assessment of the anatomical soundness, shall we say, of the skulls. So, in this case, the skull it's got a great big grin on its face and it's staring back at you with these big, wide open eyes. So, we do see a considerable variation in how accurately, in an anatomical sense, the skulls and the bones have been created. We see it here too. This is a desert crate in County Tyrone. Here we have the skull, but it's carved as this one we're looking down directly on it from above. The bones are carved here, but they're quite faint. And in fact, they are interrupted by the inscription. Now, in this case, this is the inscription to one of the most interesting people who lived in early 17th century Ulster. It's to Alexander Sanderson. And the inscription, again, some of it's in Latin, some of it's in English, but it tells us he was a foot soldier in Belgium. He was a cavalry officer in Poland. He then came to Ireland, where he was High Sheriff and Justice of the Peace. So in fact, we know that Alexander Sanderson, Captain Alexander Sanderson, was, like many, many Scots in the early 17th century, someone who went to Europe to fight during the 9 Years' War. We can pick him up in records fighting or involved or stationed in Eastern Europe, in Russia, Scandinavia, in the service of, say, Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden, or whoever it might be. So he's someone who had experience in the east of Europe, returns to Scotland, and then sets his sight towards Ulster. And he acquires a plantation grant in East County Tyrone. So he's not one of the original undertakers in the plantation scheme, but he's part of that wave of newcomers who come in within 10 years of the plantation and establish themselves and set themselves up in Ulster, acquiring lands from others who had given up or sold or surrendered their lands. The symbols of death are not exclusively found on stones to the Scots or even to the English for that matter. This is a very interesting stone. This is from Carndona in North Donegal and Inishowen, north of Inishowen. This is a Doherty stone. It's from 1636. You think maybe 1686, but I think maybe 1636. It's quite faint. You need to get the sun at the right angle. I don't know how much better this is, but we see the skull, the crossed bones, the bell, okay, which was rung at funerals. It's another one of the mortality symbols that we frequently find on headstones. And here we have a representation of an hourglass, time running out. So symbols of death, they transcend, you might say, other divisions within the province. So we're finding them on memorials to the English, to the Scots, and to the Irish as well. An ultimate slide. This is the monument to Bishop William Bedell down at Kilmore in County Cavan. Bedell, of course, very well known, and it's been mentioned already. Brendan has edited a recent book on Bedell. It's a flat ledger stone on a raised sort of vault. It's been broken sadly. You can see a metal pin holding it together here. We have the bishop's mitre at the top. We have the coat of arms, very elaborate mantling around it. And down here again, the skull, the crossbones, the hourglass on its side. Sometimes when an hourglass is shown on its side, it represents life that has been cut short suddenly or abruptly. And we know that Bedell died in 1642, in the year after the uprising, and we know he'd suffered various privations as a result of that. But look here, the columns here, they're capitals. So classicism is also coming into the fore now, and we see it represented on tombstones. Notice here the open book, very appropriate given Bedell's patronage of the translation of the Old Testament into Irish. Now, the memorial has been restored or repaired at different times. The inscription here has certainly been recut since the original, but still it's a remarkable memorial to a remarkable individual. The final one I want to show you is not a gravestone proper. It's an astonishing stone in some ways. It's actually built into a bridge in the village of Artigarvan in County Tyrone, a couple of miles north of Strabane. Sadly, it's in much worse condition now than when this photograph was taken. And Bob was very interested in this particular stone. But you can see the inscription Adi Gloriam Robertus Algio, 2nd of May, 1625. And it displays on it a crucifixion scene. Okay, and you might think, that's a strange stone. Well, first of all, Algio. Who's Algio? Is he Italian? Well, actually, Algio was a Scot. A very influential Scot. Came from Paisley in Scotland. They had been closely associated with the Hamiltons, the Abercorn Hamiltons in Paisley in Scotland, and they turn up in Strabane Barony as part of the plantation scheme there. And they're very much involved in implementing that scheme. Robert Algio was essentially a land steward or agent to the Hamiltons. And like the Hamilton landlords, the Algios were a prominent Catholic family. In fact, it's recorded that Robert Algio opened his home for the celebration of Mass in the late 1620s. So this is a fascinating stone. Its purpose is not quite clear. Was it intended for a new Catholic place of worship? Was it created because of a misguided sense that somehow something like this could be accommodated in the plantation scheme by the late 1620s? It's very strange. How it ended up on the bridge is another mystery. Can't answer that one either. But still, here we have, in the heart of Plantation Ulster, a memorial featuring a crucifixion scene, an emblem associated with the Counter-Reformation, turning up on the memorial to a Scotsman who was responsible for helping to implement the plantation scheme in that area. I mean, if anything captures the complexity of this period, that's it. Thank you.
Our second speaker is Dr. Brendan Scott, who is the manager of the Irish Family History Foundation, author and editor of a number of books and essays relating to religion, society and trade in the 16th and 17th centuries, and the editor of the Brefna Journal. Two of his forthcoming publications are the Cavan entry in the Irish Historical Towns Atlas series with the Royal Irish Academy, and an edition of the Returns of the Royal Visitations of the Church of Ireland in 1622, published by the Irish Manuscripts Commission. Brendan is the editor of Society and Administration in Ulster's Plantation Towns, published by Four Courts Press in 2019. And his most recent book is an edited volume of essays, Bishop William Bedell, 1571 to 1642, His Life, Work and Contemporaries, published in 2025. And Brendan's going to speak to us on the subject of the Ulster Plantation Towns.
Well, thank you very much for the very kind invite to speak today. It's been a great day. I've really enjoyed it. I've learned an awful lot, including from Tom O'Connor the correct pronunciation of prosopography. So that's been very helpful. I don't mind writing the word, but I usually say a lisp, but I'm quite happy. Prosopography. Great. I would say as well that when I was driving up here today, I drove through 3 incorporated Ulster Plantation towns, Clogher, and Enniskillen, and then arrived in Belfast here. And as someone I would just like to mention, whose second anniversary was just a few days ago, was the late Ray Gillespie, a proud Belfast man. And I thought of him when I was driving up today, because if anyone ever visited him in his office in Maynooth, where Tom worked with him for many years, the screensaver on his PC was the Belfast Charter. So he never forgot where he came from. And I just, as I say, it was his anniversary a few days ago, and I just wanted to remember him here. So what I'm going to do is talk about the plantation towns in a very broad way, because in 20-25 minutes, an hour, no. You can only do so much, and but I would point you towards a book that I edited a few years ago about Ulster Plantation towns, not because I'm not blowing my own trumpet, but because of the great articles that were in it. Paddy was in it, William was in it, Anna Lee was in it, and I missed a trick by not getting David Heffernan in it, but he wrote a nice review of it, so it all worked out well. But anyway, if you are interested, there's lots of good stuff in there if you want to learn more about this. So in the establishment, I suppose, of urban settlements as key components in any successful plantation had long been recognised by the English Crown. In the late 16th century, Edmund Spencer, himself a beneficiary of the Munster plantation, wrote in his view of the state of Ireland that nothing doth sooner cause any civility in any country than many market towns, by reason that people repairing thither for their needs will daily see and learn civil manners. Thomas Blennerhassett at Planter Basin Fermanagh stressed the importance of an urban network of incorporated towns, cities and boroughs in bringing what he believed to be civility to an untamed wild region. Towns in the colonial context were, as Willie Smith writes, frontier outposts created to dominate and reorganise hitherto hostile territories, and were, in his view, the central instruments of imperial expansion and control. Each plantation town was a manifestation and expression of the strength of colonial power and control, key components in the complex cultural landscape that had emerged as a result of colonialism across Ulster in the early 17th century. Fortifications were constructed, new streets laid out, and marketplaces established. The corporate status of the towns also meant that they contained a suite of administrative and cultural buildings with centralised functions such as churches, schools, markets, session houses and jails, what has been called the visual representation of the fundamental political change in the 6 planted counties. The Charter for Dungannon, for example, issued in November 1612, prioritised building projects in the town, such as the building of a parish church, a school and a marketplace. It said how many people should be settled there and the amount of land to be granted to them. And the plantation towns, are at least the newly built ones, generally comprised of long, wide, straight streets, maybe with, we've seen this map already, but I mean, if you're, if you go to Derry now, that'll get you around, you know where you're going. But hilariously, I did manage to go a wrong way down a one-way street in Derry one day, which went very well for me. And then of course, then in the centre area there, you have what's called the Diamond area, and the streets would usually converge on the Diamond. There'll be a Church of Ireland church nearby, which I think is up in the top corner up there, and then there'll be a market house and maybe doubling as a sessions house and that kind of thing. Other towns like Armagh and Cavan retained their Gaelic character much more and didn't follow a lot of those forms, and much more confused. And even if you drive around Armagh today, again, you kind of need to know where you're going, because and Irish style housing and modes of living and agriculture were to be outlawed in these towns and in the hinterland, and the Gaelic Irish were not permitted to live in the towns. But as Dave Heffernan pointed out there, I mean, they often were. Theory and practice are two very different things. I often think it's very easy for Whitehall to say, right, you should do A, B and C, but if you're stuck in the middle of Donegal in 1620 and you need tenants, you'll take whoever you can get, really. So that was happening. Now, why are they trying to keep the Gaelic Irish out? Well, partly they want to stop the British settlers from going native. That's always a great fear of any colonial power. And the other was to lead by example, the expectation being that the Gaelic Irish, when faced with this superior form of civility, would see the error of their ways and adopt the British customs and practices. And through this means of cultural osmosis, the Stuart administration, through the activities of their settlers, hoped to transform Irish space into another England. It was also expected that the use of markets and commerce would have the desired effect of civilising the native Irish population, because nothing civilises like money. You know. And it was noted in Dundrum in County Down, which is outside the official plantation. But again, as I think David said, or perhaps Andrew, I mean, you know, like the plantation doesn't stop at a county border or county boundary. You know, like oftentimes these guys are buying up lands in neighbouring counties, which aren't, like Clonus, which isn't, like that has a diamond. You know, and Castleblaney and Monaghan and all these different places. So it's not just as simple as the plantation stops here at this line. You know, it seeps through. And so in Dundrum in Down, in 1629, it was noted that this notion of markets and commerce would be the means by which the rude and country people of that region may be led to a more humane and civil mode of life. Of course, this being early modern Ireland, the outcome was not as the Stuart administration may have expected or hoped. In Ulster, the decision regarding the location of these new towns was in the hands of the plantation commissioners, who by 1609 had identified 25 locations where corporate towns might be established. Now, some of these changed along the way, and there was some mention of that earlier. Some fell by the wayside, like in Omagh. The plan to incorporate Omagh was abandoned when it was realised that the land surrounding the town had been leased in 1610 to John Lee, who was the constable of the fort there, without any obligation on him to establish an urban settlement. So that was Omagh gone. The fort settlement in Mountjoy, which had been established to support communication across Lough Neagh, was no longer necessary. They didn't need that then, so it wasn't incorporated, so it fell off the list. But in any case, there was 15 towns incorporated between 1610 and 13, with 12 of those in 1613, and then there's a few outliers after that. Killybegs in 1615, Clogher in 1629, and St Johnson around 1630ish, or maybe we're not entirely sure. But there's a map of the towns as they ended up being incorporated. So you can kind of tell the way I drove up to Belfast today along the line there. So, as I say, the ones that are in red are new ones that weren't on the original list, and then there's some of them that have fallen off, like Omagh in the middle there, and a few others as well. Now, some of the town sites to be incorporated were chosen for strategic reasons, like, as I say, when they were talking about Mountjoy, for example, but they fell off. So Belturbet in Cavan was situated on the banks of the Erne at a fording point, a good way to get in and out of South Ulster, so it was incorporated. Other charters were granted to pre-existing settlements, which were now regularised and brought under the control of the town. And a number of those incorporated towns had existed for centuries prior to the Ulster Plantation, including, as I said a minute ago, Cavan and Armagh. Carrickfergus in Antrim, and again outside the official plantation, they had a corporation certainly by 1375, maybe as early as 1260. By the 16th century, so before it got this new incorporation, Carrickfergus was a flourishing trading port, probably the unofficial capital of Ulster, really. And then there's other towns, as I said, like Ballyshannon, Coleraine, Derry, Carrickfergus, as I say. They're already thriving port towns before they were ever incorporated. Over the following years, these towns developed under the aegis of a diverse range of patrons, as we've seen already, from individual local landlords and corporations to the powerful London companies. Each had differing motivations, ambitions and abilities as urban developers, which accounted for the varied extent and appearance of those plantation towns. Just to give an example, like Virginia and Belturbet and Cavan, Virginia was very slow to develop and missed out on getting a charter actually because it was slow to develop. And Belturbet was soon the largest town in Cavan, and that was largely down to the dynamism or otherwise of their founders. And when the Earl of Abercorn died in 1618, he was complaining 4 years later that Strabane had languished and drooped, so it wasn't moving. Oftentimes it was the personal dynamism of the person pushing it along, and then when they went, then there wasn't that push afterwards. So I kind of want to talk about the municipal government of these towns and these charters, which conferred a wide range of powers on the corporations, which were the governing bodies of these incorporated towns. So the corporations were empowered to dispense law and justice, to hold fairs and markets, with details in the charters usually given regarding the dates for the holding of markets and fairs and that kind of thing. The charter also outlines the initial office holders from the sovereign or the portree, the mayor essentially, down to the burgesses, the freemen, a property minority who held positions on the corporation. And the leader of the corporation goes under different titles. In Ballyshannon and in Donegal he's the portree. In Killybeg, Strabane and Dungannon he's the provost. And in Derry and Carrickfergus he's mayor. And those municipal corporations were also parliamentary constituencies, each permitted to return 2 MPs to Parliament, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The main offices which required appointments, aside from the sovereign, was a vice sovereign, a sergeant of the mace, and a town clerk or recorder, the secretary essentially. The sovereign was normally also constituted a justice of the peace, a coroner and a clerk of the market, which entitled him to levy tolls on the fairs and markets held in the town. All prestigious and profitable posts he usually held to himself. The corporation received the profits from the fairs and markets. Now, occasionally private individuals would make donations to the corporation. We saw Richard Hansard, who William showed there a moment ago, and as well as funding churches and all that sort of stuff. He also made financial provision for the corporation in Lifford in his will. The corporations not only had a great deal of economic autonomy, they also held a lot of centralised functions, such as the law courts, which normally took place in a specially built sessions house or the Thulsel, the town hall that would be in the area. And then a logical consequence of those courts was the presence of county jails in many of the corporate towns, and they show up in maps and in various records and minutes and so on, as do stocks as well. Stocks often show up for repairs to stocks, and the guy hired, to make the stocks, and these come up in the minutes in the expenditure place as well. And as I mentioned a minute ago, part of the reason for the incorporation of these towns was the political side of things. In the Parliament, which met in Dublin in 1613, it was proclaimed that for the better encouragement of the new plantations in Ulster, and generally for the drawing of inhabitants into such other places as were weakly peopled or dangerous in respect of their situations, His Majesty thought it meet to erect new corporations which would produce good effects for the strength of the kingdom. The Irish Parliament had, and I should remember as well, a great parliamentary historian who we lost last year as well, Bridget McGrath, who was another fine scholar of towns and parliaments in early modern Ireland. The Irish Parliament had long been viewed by the old English Catholic majority as a means of protecting itself against the Protestant Reformation and the rise of new English interests in Ireland. So long as they held the majority, there was a certain amount of protection. So each county returned 2 MPs to the House of Commons, along with 37 towns throughout Ireland, but only 2 of which were in Ulster, Carrickfergus and Downpatrick. And it was envisaged, as I said initially, that 25 Ulster towns would be incorporated, with the notion was exclusively Protestant membership. And so it's obvious that James I and the Dublin government were hoping to pack any new parliament with their own supporters, which is exactly what happened in that parliament from 1613 to 15. And so it was that the Catholic faction lost control of the Irish Parliament. But the extirpation of Catholicism, one of the pillars on which the Ulster Plantation was built, in theory, did not always run smoothly, even from the inside. And again, William, and I think David has mentioned this, George Hamilton, the brother of the first Earl of Abercorn, who planted Strabane, was a Catholic. The family used their residences for religious services and so on, and much to the annoyance of Bishop George Downham of Derry, who accused Hamilton of planting popery there. And despite examples like Hamilton and the work of David Edwards, who wrote a lovely essay about a haven of popery, about British Catholics moving to Ireland to get away from English scrutiny, the Reformation hadn't really impacted on Ulster before the early 17th century. And when parish churches came to be built on new estates, they were frequently constructed not on the traditional medieval sites that were inconvenient for the new settlement pattern, but rather in the newly established town where it was thought settlers would congregate. And here in Belfast, Arthur Chichester built a parish church for his new town, not on the traditional site at Shankill, but on the site of a medieval chapel at the ford across the Lagan, because it was more convenient for his new settlers. This was a common development in the Ulster Plantation in the Conwall parish in Raphoe in 1622. It was noted that as the old parish church was now ruinated and decayed, being situated before in a remote waste place, it would be fitting to be transported to a market town called Letterkenny, where there is 80 families of British inhabitants within the midst of the parish. A similar example can be found in Belturbet and Cavan, which was in the parish of Anna. The commissioners reported in 1622 that although a Protestant cleric was living in the town, there was as yet no new church built, with Anna's pre-Reformation medieval parish church about 3-4 miles outside the town. So it was recommended by the Commission in 1622 that as there were a great store of Protestants in and about the town, there should be a church built there. Thomas Moyne, who was the Church of Ireland Bishop of Kilmore, agreed with this recommendation, reporting in 1622 that the church is ruinous and unfit to be repaired by reason of the remoteness from Belturbet. A corporation newly erected is a place fit for a church to be built de novo. And you can find numerous examples of that across the province at this time. And I want to talk about the markets. I mean, incorporation generally went hand in hand with the granting of a market, which was such an important source of revenue for the town's corporation. And in many of the minutes which survived for the corporations at this time, the charges to be imposed upon sales at market and upon the traders themselves are noted, which gives an indication of the goods and the type of merchants operating in the towns during this period. Extra fees were charged if a trader erected a stall rather than sold their goods on the ground, which probably applied to visiting traders who would, there were traders who would just travel the island, going from market to market, fair to fair, and selling the wares wherever they went. But some towns also saw the development or repurposing of more permanent buildings as shops to handle burgeoning trade there. Belfast's economy seemed to have been wealthy enough that by 1639 permanent structures were in situ at the marketplace rather than temporary stalls put up on the day of the market or the fair and then broken down again at the end of the day. And the fixed nature of those buildings, I think, indicates a confidence in the viability of the market and long-term plans of the settler community to remain where they were. Of course, 1639, 2 years later, comes 1641, so the best laid plans. The substantial income accruing from these markets and fairs meant that the rights attached to them were guarded jealously by town corporations. Colerane's Corporation, for example, authorised in 1650 an official to investigate whether other markets were operating within 7 miles of Coleraine, and if there were, the corporation decreed that such course may be taken for vindication of the franchises and privileges of this corporation as shall be fitting. Likewise, it was written into Derry's charter that no other market could be held within 7 miles of the city, as such competition might attract traders and customers alike away from their town and its fairs and markets. And that was so jealously guarded because that was such an income spinner for the corporations. And there's also an element of town planning in these new towns, which can be seen in the separate areas which were developed in some towns for the buying and selling of animals, aside from the market square or the diamond. One example being what's called the cow market here in Belturbet in 1723, a few years later. But this is the main street. I grew up just about in that house there, that right there. And so this is what's now the Fair Green, was called the cow market. And then the actual diamond is there, the Church of Ireland church there, and then the town hall, the market house is called there, and the diamond just there. And again, you bring the cattle up around the back of the town because you don't want, the inevitable thing that happens when you have lots of livestock around. So it keeps the town a bit cleaner. And Belfast in 1639 attempted to control this issue as well by fining any traders who didn't keep their livestock in the pens provided. So they had pens there to go. And in fact, in the house I grew up in, which backed onto the thing there was a garage at the back of the house, and there was these huge chains, like massive, like a thing where you would tie your animals to. Like the fair ended there, I think, in the 60s, but the chains and the large things were there that you could still tie your animals to. So I'm assuming whoever lived there before we lost a money spinner there, unfortunately. What can you do? So there were poor towns like Carrickfergus, whose market was held on what was described as a handsome, large street. And they often, but not always, developed their markets close to quays. Coleraine Saturday Market was initially held outside the town before being moved within. And here's, now this is the OS map for Donegal town. But again, if you look, Like this is the diamond, and this is the area where you'd have the market. It opens up wide. The market house is right beside it. You're right beside the water here as well. And so the session house is there, a fish market. So everything kind of centralised in that sort of an area. And as I say, this is the widest part of the town. So you can get people in, you can get stalls in, and you can get selling whatever it is you need. But some of these areas weren't developed as well as it could be. And Derry's market area, immediately following the plantation, lacked the necessary storage facilities or even weights, even though the quay there was reckoned to be the largest in Ireland. While in Coleraine, the custom house was situated in the middle of the town, well away from the quay, and was described as being little bigger than a cobbler's shop, which was plainly an unsatisfactory situation for everyone involved. David here did a lovely article in Analecta a few years ago where you were able to get a great description of these towns around this time. And like an indication of the popularity and necessity of the markets can be seen in a comment given by a deponent in the 1641 depositions. And this observer remarked that Moneymore in County Londonderry was as full of Irish in the early days of the 1641 Rising as if it had been a market day. So obviously the Irish are coming in on those days. And just then to segue into the Gaelic Irish in the towns, as David here said already, I mean, they didn't really go away. You know, they were still there. And there's a document entitled The Discourse for Reformation of Ulster by Colonies, which dates from 1598, pondering the failure of the Laois and Offaly plantations in the 1550s, and it pointed towards the letting of lands out to the native Irish as a main reason for the scheme's ultimate failure there. Only English tenants should be allowed in any future plantation of Ulster, it concluded. Yet, when the time for plantation came, just over a decade later, this advice and the hard-learned experience of previous plantation efforts fell on deaf ears. There was not always a huge effort made to remove the native Irish tenants from the towns and lands given over to the plantation. Landlords acclimatising themselves to the difficulties of attracting sufficient British planters were only too glad at times to accept the Irish on these lands. And so serious a problem was this that royal proclamations were issued every year between 1616 and 19, ordering Irish inhabitants to vacate the plantation towns, and fines were introduced in 1619 for native Irish tenants. But these fines were no deterrent, and as the undertakers found that the native Irish were willing, however reluctantly, to pay a higher rent. And again, back to Belturbet, in 1622 it was reported that there are many Irish dwelling upon it, and the British complain thereof generally that they can get no reasonable bargains till the Irish be removed. So the Irish are willing to pay a higher rent, and the English can't get a good deal because the Irish are paying a higher rent, which was generally a terrible deal for the Irish. It's normally a shorter lease on a higher rent. And that's okay when things are going good, but then when things go bad, as things do in the 1630s, there's a series of harvest failures and different things, a recession, suddenly you're not able to pay that high rent anymore, and that becomes a real problem then in 1641. And despite the orders that each plantation town was to be filled with English-style structures, it was reported in 1622 that Gaelic Irish house forms outnumbered the Irish style 122 to 94 in the London Company villages in County Londonderry. Part of the reason for this was the failure of the planters to provide English-style housing. By 1622, of 20 individuals who had undertaken to build an Armagh, only 7 had actually done so. And unlike many of the towns that were granted a charter, Cavan Town retained much of its Gaelic character in the terms of the makeup of its corporation. There's lots of Irish names, Brady's and different things in that first charter. Cavan wasn't alone in that. In Oher, in 1613, in this charter, there's an O'Reilly, must have snuck up from Cavan. He's one of the burgesses there. And although Armagh was redeveloped along standard plantation lines following its incorporation, it also held on to a large Gaelic population in the immediate years following. And some towns did make an effort to rid themselves of the Irish. The 1611 survey of Lifford mentioned that it was well furnished with inhabitants of English, Scottish and Irish, whereas by 1622 it was noted that its 54 houses were inhabited for the most part with English, so the Irish seemed to be mostly gone. And the same was the case in Donegal town. They had 30 houses rather than 54, but again there had been Irish there in 1611. By 1622 not much sign of them. An order was given to the planters in Derry which stated that they shouldn't take on Irish apprentices but rather source underprivileged children from England for this purpose rather than bringing in Irish ones. And there's cartographic evidence as well depicting Irish-style vernacular buildings inside towns. There's this map of Carrickfergus, a lovely map, I'm sure a lot of you know, from 1560, and you can see these kind of Irish-style dwellings. Now, as Dave mentioned earlier on, that's not necessarily indicative that there are Irish people living in them. It's indicative of the people that had available to build houses for them. So it's not necessarily the same thing. But it does give you some idea. And the same with Armagh. This is what we saw earlier on. Again, up here, these sort of more Irishy vernacular style housing. And like, so for example, in Ballyshannon in 1622, there were 30 houses built in the Irish style, but they were inhabited mostly by English soldiers, with a few Irish, but mostly English soldiers living in the Irish style house. And just to conclude, despite all of these setbacks and difficulties, I think it must be argued, I think, that the system of corporate towns in the Ulster Plantation was ultimately successful. And the greatest argument in support of the success of the plantation and these towns is the fact that they're still there. And that many of them, up until fairly recently, contained or continued to hold corporate style structures with town councils in the Republic and up here up until the 70s as well. And the towns, especially the town centres, are still laid out, I think, in much the same way as they had been 400 years ago. And as I chose the Derry one, but you could really choose an awful lot of plantation towns, particularly in the centre of the towns, and say, you know, where is the church? The buildings may have changed, but the streetscapes are generally in the same layout. And so I think the people who lived there when these towns were first granted corporation status 400 odd years ago will still recognise the streetscapes, I think, as many of them lie today. And the fact that these towns have retained much of their physical, corporate and cultural identities, I think, is testament to the success of the ventures begun there just over 400 years ago. Thank you very much.
10 minutes for questions to either William or to Brendan. Start over there.
I wouldn't like to make an estimate of it. I mean, because there's no survey of Irish population before, before the plantation, so we can't really tell. But what I would say is that the numbers of Irish are usually higher than the administration would have liked. And you can see that, like, by 1641, there are links created, like in the depositions, when an Irish person is attacking an English deponent, and the English deponent says later on what happened to them, and the English deponent can often name them, saying that's, Tom O'Connor, that's Paddy Fitzgerald, that's whoever. They were the people, so they know them. That's the first thing. And then secondly, they often ask them, why are you doing this? And the Irish person would say, well, we're doing this because of A, B and C. Well, what language are they asking that in? Someone is speaking English or Irish and vice versa. So there's obviously that kind of cross-pollination going on. And as I said, I think a lot of that would have been happening in marketplaces when people have stuff to sell and then they go to a pub afterwards and chat and they just get to know each other. And sometimes that works in their favour. There's people who were saved by Irish people during 1641, and conversely there are people who are sought out because they were not liked by the Irish and they go after them specifically. So there's all sorts of, it's very human, I think, a lot of it. We can recognise those behaviours in, well, not stringing up someone and hanging them, that's not a very nice behaviour, but you can understand the dislike or likes between people. And a lot of that is because they are meeting somewhere. And like a lot of the urban sprawl now, they wouldn't recognise those things. But the centres are generally, long, wide, straight enough kind of streets with a market house, a diamond, a church nearby. You kind of know like what you're going to get in plantation towns, and so they're generally laid out the same sort of way. That's kind of like the classical styles that they're built on, and you see that very clearly, like in the Derry one, in the Raven map from 1622, and the earlier one as well. These very classically straight lines, which hold to this day. Whereas if you look at Armagh here, it's all kind of radiating down from the hill, and it's all kind of a circular sort of a thing going round, and not as clearly delineated, I think. Whether they're built exactly to the same spec is a different thing. But the fact that I myself and William have worked on trade in Ulster and around this time, and they're bringing over, like the English and Scottish planters are bringing over home. They're bringing English hops, for example, Manchester Tweed, whiskey, huge amounts of whiskey, and all these sort of things. And so they're bringing home with them, and they're bringing styles that they would recognise. And so I think that they are importing that over. And there are there are one or two references in Gaelic poetry and different things to, the woods are gone and it's now this kind of not a cement city, but that sort of idea. They're bemoaning the loss of the countryside and these new urban things that are being set up. But I mean that's like one poet, whereas if you look, they're all still coming in, to sell and buy and do whatever. So
in general, again, to make a general comment, Latin tends to be something seen on monuments erected by members of the clergy. So Adair, for example, Dean Adair, he was a Scotsman, but he was a senior figure within the New Reformed Church. And over the course of the 17th century, if you see Latin on a stone, it's not exclusively so, but very often it will be on monuments erected by the clergy.
Even though it's post-Reformation.
Yeah.
if I could just add in there, myself and David are working on church visitations in 1622, and generally they're English, but there will be chunks of Latin at the Church of Ireland visitations, and there will be chunks of Latin in the middle of it, and then it'll jump into English again, and then back into Latin. So it does happen.
Yeah. So the Bedell inscription in Kilmore is in Latin.
Corn, grains, that kind of thing is being grown. But like the Irish, this was kind of always a complaint about the English had with the Irish, that they just sort of had cattle and they didn't really go in for arable. You know, like these lazy guys, you know, they're not using the land. We'll come in and we'll make best use of the land. So that's a common complaint. So when the English come in and the Scottish as well, they're using, you know, like I say, tillage farming and that kind of thing a lot more. And as I say, a lot of grains, a lot of things like that. And they are importing things like English hops and things like that. So they're obviously trying to get those tastes that they're used to at home over here. So there's a lot of that going on. And you will get, like there'll be certain, they'll have in corporation minutes laid out how much taxation on various produce that they're selling in the market. So you can see there then the lists, generally for sort of, for luxury items, we'll call them, there'll be a higher tax than the everyday bread, grains, that kind of thing.
Okay, sorry if you have more questions, but we are out of time. Mary asked me just to remind you of the URL, the website address for the people of the Ulster Plantation Database, and that is https://ulster-settlers.maynoothuniversity.ie. Okay, so it's ulster-settlers.maynoothuniversity.ie. So please explore the site, give us feedback on it as well. Yeah. So thank you all very much. Thanks particularly for